Hello, my name is David Rouse. I teach here in the core division at Champlain College, and I'm going to be talking briefly about some exercises that I use in my Core 120 Concepts of Community course to deal with Plato's Republic. Plato's Republic is very difficult, not just for students here, but in general, so it's always about trying to find meaningful ways to make connections to the world around us that also connect to the bigger issues of our course. And I think I've developed a few of them. They don't always work, but first and foremost, I don't deal with at all in this course the two most famous parts of the Republic, the allegory of the cave and the theory of forms. Instead, I prefer to focus on the first three books, in particular books 2 and 3, where Socrates is focusing on explaining his ideal community, the city of Callipolis, and how justice can be found there. And he spends a lot of time talking about the guardian class that's going to basically be the caretakers for this community. He talks at some length about the education for these people because it's very important to develop people with all of the right qualities. They want to have guardians that are spirited and courageous, but that are still under control, diplomatic, tactful, restrained. So in order to achieve this, he develops his own curriculum that is based on two primary foundations, what he calls musical training and what he calls physical training. And musical training isn't just music, it seems to also include things like mythology, to some extent philosophy, sociology, poetry, song, history, all sorts of things. Broadly, the humanities, but there is more to it than that, of course. Let's see here. The idea here isn't just to come up with a good way to educate these people, it's to achieve a certain balance so that, again, you don't have people that are too savage or too soft. And one of the concerns that Socrates focuses on here is to make sure that these guardians never hear anything, any stories, any poems, any legends, any myths, that could make the gods look bad, that could make the heroes of Greek mythology look bad, that could make the city-states, in this case Athens, look bad. The problem, of course, would be that if the guardians ever see anything like this, that they might lose their appreciation or their respect for not only their gods, but also the worthiness of their society, their government, their leaders, and so on. So what we're talking about here, front and center, is censorship more than anything else. This is mostly because Socrates comes right out and says that the young have difficulty distinguishing what is true from what is merely allegorical. So this is my jumping off point, this notion of what kind of educational curriculum we want to have in order to produce certain kinds of people in order that they can influence the shaping and the development of the society in question. So the exercises that I have, there are 3 of them. I like to break my students into groups, ideally of 3 to 4 students. That's good because there is more airtime available for small groups when people can speak. If they're only in 2 or 3 or 4 people groups, it's much easier to do that than if they're in a group of 18 or 20 where there aren't really as many opportunities to speak up. Additionally, a lot of students are more nervous speaking in front of big groups, so it's more likely, hopefully, that they will participate in small groups. So, I have 3 exercises, if we could look at the PowerPoint that I have developed here. These are my 3 exercises, all focusing on education as a prime reflector of societal values, and obviously that's a big part of Core 120 Concepts of Community. So, here we go, Education and Censorship, Plato's Republic and Education in America. Exercise number 1, very simple. You get your students into the groups and then you ask them to discuss and then report back to the class, what do you think is the most important subject in a person's education? And some students are going to want to ask, are we talking about little kids, are we talking about older kids? You can set it however you want to set it. I find that in general you want to have it say, roughly age 15 or 16, more or less on the cusp of becoming an active agent in society, an adult, and so forth. So that's where I set it in case students tend to ask. So what do you think is the most important subject in a person's education? And explain. And then secondarily, did everyone in your group agree or were there any minority opinions? Again, explain. I often expect at a business and computer school like Champlain that you were going to hear a lot of things like mathematics, economics, finance, perhaps some aspect of computer engineering or computer programming, something along those lines. But sometimes you do get very different answers. Just the other day I heard a very spirited defense of the humanities in general and literature in particular. You'll also get some students occasionally that will say history, foreign languages, things along those lines. They're all good answers. but it gets the students thinking about what you need to do in order to create a society that has the characteristics that you find desirable. Next exercise, and this is of course a separate one, you have to give them a chance to clear their heads from the last one, but exercise 2, do we practice any censorship in the United States today? Explain. And usually what you're going to hear about is movie and entertainment and, songs and so forth that have things that either get, bleeped or edited or have explicit lyrics or, something along those lines, some sort of warning. So that's usually where the students are going to start. Taking that vein, when media are edited for content, what sort of material gets cut out? Further, why do you think that certain material is censored and not other stuff? And what does this say about the society that we're in? What are we afraid of just as much as what are we hoping to create? Next, do other societies use censorship or hide things from their people? And this can open up into a bigger conversation about the censorship of news, obviously, the use of propaganda, and so forth. There's a whole lot of ways that this can go. Next, do other societies censor the same material that Americans do or different? And I had a couple of students just yesterday that were talking about this. One of them is from Europe, and he was commenting that the first thing that he noticed is that we don't have any problem splashing all sorts of horrific violence on primetime TV, but anything along the lines of sexually suggestive material tends to get cut out. And he was saying, where he's come from, Britain, that's kind of the opposite. He also suggested that in other societies in Europe, notably he mentioned France, that you tend to get a lot more of a casual attitude towards sex and nudity, but it is in fact the violence that tends to get edited out much more frequently. So if you compare the two, you really get a sense that the different societies fear different things, are concerned about different things, and are trying to create different sorts of citizens. Next exercise. This one is a little bit further, a little bit bigger, a little bit more involved, and a little bit more academically rigorous because we actually use some real documents here. In this exercise, each group gets an article or editorial from the recent media that addresses activism in educational curricula or in public history. Here are several examples of documents that I use. One is from the American Indian movement called Why Autonomous Aim Opposes Columbus Day and Columbus Day Parades. Obviously this speaks more directly to public history than to actual school curriculum. Second, something from Lori Goodstein of the New York Times about the seemingly endless debate in American education between evolution and intelligent design. This one in particular refers to the pretty well-known case in the Dover, Pennsylvania school district from 2005 through 2008, again called Judge Rejects, Teaching Intelligent Design. The next one is from John D. Sutter. This is an editorial from CNN. It's called Is Oklahoma Scared of AP History? The next one is from Raw Story, a rather subversive alternative sort of news outlet called Texas Approves Radical Right-Wing History Books. And the last one is also from CNN. This is from a reporter named Kelly Wallace. She's reporting on a story about Denver area students accusing their school board of censoring U.S. history because there were aspects of the AP curriculum as well as the U.S. history curriculum that they had there that the school board is trying to change. You'll notice that most of these, or I guess 3 or 4 of these, tend to be about activist conservative efforts to create a curriculum that reflects their ideal of a society. This includes things like an emphasis on religion in American history, potentially a de-emphasis of the separation of church and state. You will also see a lot about American exceptionalism. You will see things about capitalism and the predominance of limited government interference in the market and the role of the free market in presumably developing American character as well as American economics. But there is also the one at the top, which is perhaps more of the liberal perspective about trying to revise our perception of history and the rules of different peoples, ethnicities, religious groups, etc. within it. So I've tried to create something that demonstrates that this isn't simply a liberal issue or a conservative issue, but that basically all issues have proponents. Both sides argue in favor of trying to make their version of American history and society the dominant one. Next, continuing with exercise 3, The way it works, we have each group read over their article or editorial, and then have them answer the following questions before reporting back to the rest of the class. In particular, what is this article about? What changes to education do these activists want to make? Be specific. How would these changes theoretically alter society? Specifically, how would they achieve the goals of the activists in question? And again, this goes to what kind of citizens do we want to create, and further, what sort of society we're hoping that the influence of these citizens will mold. And then lastly, as far as you can tell, what is the bias of the author of the article? How does the author feel about this issue exactly, and how can you tell? Be specific. This is not a standard component of Core 120 Concepts of Community, but I always like to try to emphasize critical faculties when it comes to analyzing any text or any ideas. So this I just sort of throw in there, and it gives them some practice thinking about ideas that are emphasized or de-emphasized, things that are completely omitted, the diction that is used, the title, quotes from either one side or the other that might make one side or the other sound particularly reasonable or intelligent, or the opposite, unreasonable, unintelligent. And if you see, going backwards one step, perhaps back, well, pardon me. There we go. One example of this is the fourth document that I give them. Texas approves radical right-wing history books. Obviously, if the author puts radical in there, they're trying to present these ideas as extreme and outside the norm. So that's the sort of thing I want to get them thinking about when I ask them to talk about the bias of the article. So those are all of my exercises. The only other thing that I would add is that it's important that students realize that this is dependent upon historical context, and it's not like we've had educational values stable and predictable and consistent for the last 200 years. Obviously, most of the changes that are currently in effect, that a lot of, in this particular case, conservatives are trying to change, it's not like this has never happened before. During the Civil Rights Movement, of course, in previous decades, all of this stuff was addressed, and there was an effort to make history more inclusive, perhaps more critical, perhaps less celebratory, and so on. So it's not like, one side does this and the other one doesn't. Through different historical generations, you have different values that are in the ascendancy, and obviously now most education is presented with an eye toward the ideas that came out of the Civil Rights Movement. And for lots of people, these are not the best way to run educational curricula, and they have new ideas. So it's important that students realize that things change depending on the society that they're in, and give it a couple of decades and things can change back. That concludes this core talk on Plato's Republic for Core 120 Concepts of Community. Thank you very much.